is a farmer, his fingers they are green, and he has planted the biggest crop the world has ever seen. Oh, Stalin was a mighty man, and a mighty man was he. He led the Soviet people on the road to victory. All through the revolution, he fought at Lenin's side, and they made a combination till the day that Lenin died. He said, come on, you people, we must work with brain and hand. And then one day the Nazis came into the Soviet land. They plundered to the Volga, to Stalingrad. And then Joe Stalin said, come on, me boys, and kicked them out again. Oh, Stalin was a southerner, in Georgia he was born, where the oranges grow thick and fast and fields of waving corn. And Stalin is a farmer, his fingers they are green, and he has planted the biggest crop the world has ever seen. One day he looked upon the map and frowned and shook his head. There's too much brown and not enough green, these were the words he said. We'll have to change the weather, boys, he said, and then he smiled. So let's begin by planting trees along 3,000 miles. So Stalin rolled his sleeves up then and said it's time to start. The Volga River and the Don, they are too far apart. I think we'd better join them, so come and help me, pal, and we'll build a mighty waterway, the Volga-Don Canal. Then Stalin went into the north, and there saw rivers three, all emptying their waters into the polar sea. Now that's not right, Joe Stalin said, these rivers, they are ours. We'll turn them round and make them work and make electric power. There was a range of mountains that were standing in the way, so Stalin put his hand out and smoothed them all away. For Joe, he is determined to make the land all green, and that's the biggest project that the world has ever seen. Oh, Stalin is a mighty man, and he has a mighty plan. He's harnessed nature to the plow to work for the good of man. He's hammered out the future, the fortunate he has been, and he's made the worker state the best the world has ever seen.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the program. It is the 28th of December, 2023. And we are coming to you live with a couple of issues on the agenda tonight to look through, one arising out of last night's live stream and one that I wanted to talk about in response to various different things that have come up over the last few weeks, which is the subject of capitalism and addiction. But first things first, let's do a roll call through the chat section, see who's here. So Banana Bender, who says Tottenham are playing Brighton in 10 minutes. Well, if I had to choose between the two, I'd choose Brighton. Let's hope that the Seagulls can win. So we've also got Will Johnson, we've got Lars from Sweden, and Munis, good evening to you. We've got Arnold, good evening from sunny Bridlington. Well, good evening to you. From Perfidious Albion, we have Peter. We say good afternoon to Martin and good afternoon to Philbin out there on Rhode Island. And Nick Wilson, good evening. James Graham, Paul McCord, comrade over there on the other end of the Mersey. And it's a good evening to Rob, who compliments the tie. Thank you very much. I made a careful note to put one on this evening. And we've got Alan out over there in Oakland, USA. So, good evening to everybody. And first things first, I'm going to pick up on a comment that was made on last night's broadcast where I was making observations about the failures of the Soviet leadership to understand imperialism. And a comment was made on the Telegram page that that Khrushchev was the product of a pro-capitalist tendency, and therefore it didn't matter that, I'm paraphrasing this user's question, his complete failure to understand Lenin's work on imperialism and his theoretical ignorance could be explained by the fact that he was simply an opportunist and a capitalist restorationist. Now, I would say, in response to that, that I disagree. And I disagree for the following reasons. Yes, it is correct. As Roger Kieran and Thomas Kenny point out in their work, Socialism Betrayed, the material basis for Khrushchevite revisionism was in the corrupt elements within the hierarchy of the CPSU, pro-capitalist elements, etc., liquidationist elements, treacherous elements. That's where the basis of it was. That's all true. And the other thing to bear in mind, though, and this is where my objection comes in, is that the number of outright traitors, gangsters, liquidationists, rabid pro-capitalists, and veiled reactionaries in the CPSU, though significant, was a tiny minority. So much so that these people couldn't come out in the immediate period after the death of Stalin and openly proclaim themselves, which is why, of course, Khrushchev had to do all of the contortionist acts of political acts of contortion that he did to, whether he understood this is what he was doing or not is irrelevant, but this is the effect, to demoralize and destroy the working class militants within the CPSU and to destroy the revolutionary movement, especially in the imperialist countries. He never succeeded in destroying it completely in the colonized nations, which were still pushing forward in revolutionary processes right up until the end of the 1980s. But in terms of his open desire to reach a bargain with imperialism, his destruction of the revolution, or his aiding in the destruction of the revolutionary tendencies within the European Communist Party, and he's, of course, in endorsement of the revisionism that grew in the CPUSA. That is all part of his attempted bargain with imperialism. But to return to my objection to the questioner's point, why is it that, do I think that the stunning ignorance and lack of theoretical knowledge in so much of the CPSU matters? It matters because Khrushchev and the revisionists and the various nefarious characters who supported him, again, as I said, they were only ever a small minority. Even within the CPSU and the right wing of the CPSU, the revisionist social democratic wing of the CPSU, the number of people who were actually committed to outright liquidationism was very, very small. So much so that, of course, they couldn't come out and openly proclaim themselves, as I said, in the Khrushchev period, even after the secret speech, the so-called secret speech, which was, of course, broadcasted very loudly to imperialism. So Khrushchev needed to be supported in his power grab by a coalition within the party. And the fact that that coalition fell apart, and to a certain extent, in some ways, the Khrushchevite revisionists received setbacks during the Brezhnev period. They advanced on other fronts. So, for instance, the process of capitalist restoration started by Khrushchev was continued by Kosygin. So that's something which needs to be borne in mind. On the other hand, though, the Brezhnev era did see certain aspects of party rule strengthened. Like the 1977 Soviet constitution, for instance, on the face of it, and I say on the face of it, if you just take the document itself, is a document which appears to go back somewhat or overturn somewhat Khrushchev's state of all the people. It appears to be that there are revolutionary factions in the party which are pushing back towards the idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat again. That's very much what the 77 Constitution seems at least partly to be about. So there was an active contest within the CPSU that blocked the way of the most nakedly treacherous elements for quite a long time. Unfortunately, of course, this couldn't last forever. So the point I was making last night, when I was saying that what could have happened and should have happened in the CPSU, is that Gorbachev should have suffered the same fate as Zhao Ziyang in the PRC, the CPC removed Xiang from his positions and expelled him. And ultimately, he and his followers were either imprisoned or fled. Some of them fled to the United States, of course. That's what should have happened to Gorbachev. And indeed, the whole question of why this didn't happen does need to be looked at, and perhaps it's worth going back to it again, because Gorbachev, again, was only ever a minority. He and his various different acolytes who backed him up, the liquidationist tendencies, the tendencies that would, of course, ultimately abandon Gorbachev and go over to Yeltsin, they were consistently outvoted in CPSU congresses, especially after 87. In 88, 89, 90, they started losing votes whenever they came up. And Gorbachev was, of course, at a very real risk of being removed on at least a couple of occasions. What preserved him in office was not popularity, far from it. He was despised by 89. He was loved only by the imperialists. The problem was that the opposition to him ranged from the revolutionary wing of the CPSU, which was a minority at that stage, a bigger wing that was in the middle, who had supported somewhat Gorbachev in 85, 86, and 87, but was turning on him by 88 to 89. The problem was that the left and the middle, and even some elements of the Social Democrat Bukharinite leadership, which weren't liquidationists, because people like Ligachev, Yegor Ligachev in the CPSU leadership, he had been an ally of Gorbachev early on, but turned on him when he realized that Gorbachev is essentially trying to liquidate the party. So had that group been able to coalesce themselves in 88 or 89, much that was done in the fateful years could have been avoided. There could have been, if they had managed to come together and removed Gorbachev and removed Yakovlev and others, removed the open liquidationist tendency by 1989 and suppressed it, they could still have carried that off if they'd have managed to unify the left and the anti-liquidationist, anti-chaos, shall we say, elements in the center, and even some elements on the right of the party, could have been unified together, but they kept failing to unify, even though Gorbachev lost loads of votes, even though he could have easily been removed as general secretary. There was never any moment when these elements were able to unify, whereas they were to a certain extent in China, where the Deng Xiaoping, who was a revisionist, I would say, I don't think that's in any doubt, but I don't think that he, by 89, even then, was a liquidationist. Many of his followers, of course, would go down the road of potential liquidationism in China, but they are thankfully marginalized. So that when the crisis occurred in China, the left of the party, which had been opposing Deng Xiaoping all the way through the 80s, was able to insist that the leadership had to remove and act against the liquidationists, the Gorbachev types in China, remove them from their positions and have them arrested, which, again, should have been able to happen in 89 to 90, but wasn't, due to the fact that the various different factions that opposed Gorbachev were unable to unify around a common program to remove him and stop this. And that goes back to essentially a enormous weakness, theoretically speaking, on not just the center of the CPSU, which you would perhaps expect from, but a theoretical and profound political weakness of even the left in the CPSU, I think. Even the left that bitterly opposed Gorbachev. And you see this reflected in the KPRF to this day. They were unable to properly analyze a lot of what had gone on during the Khrushchev and Brezhnev periods. If you read like the KPRF's analysis, particularly at the leadership level today, you'll see the same problem going on, which is that they will correctly identify Khrushchev as a wretch. They will correctly identify Gorbachev and Yakovlev and others as traitors, but they don't generally go into, well, why had it got to the point where such characters could be in power and not be removed? Because that opens up a whole range of problems in the Brezhnev era. So the left of the CPSU itself was theoretically weak, is the point I'm making here. It's not just that Gorbachev and others were clueless buffoons who had cheated their way through their academic careers, had never read Lenin seriously, and were just opportunists. That's all true. It's that the left of the CPSU was also weak. And this is admitted to by Molotov, by the way, as early as the 1950s, when he was, because Molotov lived well into his late 80s, I think. So he was there in the 1980s. And he, in his biography, Molotov Speaks, reflected that by the early 1950s, even the Bolshevik-type wing of the Politburo, which was him and Lazar Kaganovich and others, had stopped reading. They'd stopped educating themselves. They'd stopped updating themselves on Marxist analysis. And those were the people who were in opposition to Khrushchev and in opposition to the revisionists. But they had stopped developing themselves as well. And Molotov reflects upon that and said it was we, as in those of us who believed ourselves to be in the Bolshevik-Leninist tradition, had stopped developing ourselves. And here we go into a fundamental problem, which is that even those who were opposing the revisionists have become politically and theoretically very weak. And so that they opposed the revisionists, but they were unable to properly understand them, and thus they were unable to properly combat them. So it's not just that the revisionists themselves didn't understand Lenin, even though they quoted him constantly and hid behind him at every opportunity. It's that the left of the organization have become theoretically disarmed and politically weak, and that's the point that needs to be made. And if I wasn't clear enough on that, I should have been. Okay, so, right, we've got various different comments here. Rob says Beans is also here, so good evening to you. Good evening to Lisa. Hello to Jamshi's Fish, who's joining us from Hyderabad in India. Well, good evening to you. And Banana Bender says, all liberal and establishment media in the US have written opinions and columns on basically turning on Ukraine and Zelensky. One read saying a victory doesn't mean taking back a land lost. Yeah, well, what the US imperialists are looking for, and I'll come to this in just a second, is the idea of saying, well, as long as there's a square inch of Ukraine left that they can call Ukraine, and then they'll call that a victory. Basically, that's what their tactic is. Good evening to Irish Partisan, our comrade in Minsk. Good evening to Unused Sub. And Philbin says, the Finnish Bolshevik channel goes into great detail. Are ultra-left right factions in CPSU going to transcripts of Moscow trials? Does Khrushchev connect back to this early factionalism? Well, I'd say Khrushchev is and always was, and Molotov says this as well in his memoirs. Khrushchev was always just he was a groveler, a political non-entity, in that he was a capable manager. That's why he distinguished himself. He was good at running things, or at least gave the appearance of being good at running things. But he was never a communist. He joined the party in 1918. He had been a coal miner earlier in his life. But he wasn't a worker Bolshevik. He was essentially a trade union official, is the best way I can describe him. And he'd always been an opportunist. But he was very good at actually running and administering things, which is why he was given the political officer role in Stalingrad. So he wasn't a fool. I mean, he's painted as a fool, but he wasn't a complete fool, because if he had been a complete fool, he wouldn't have got to the position that he was in. He was at least very good at efficiently managing things. But he should never have been in a position of becoming a political leader. And again, this is what Molotov reflected upon much later, in that he should never have been anywhere near the general secretaryship. The fact that he was points to a much bigger problem, which we've covered before, which is that the number of worker Bolsheviks in the organization had declined, thanks to many of them dying in World War II. And the party's balance after World War II went in far too far towards being filled with academics, intellectuals, and functionaries, which were to provide some of the basis of support for revisionism. There wasn't enough emphasis on refreshing the party's ranks with a new generation of worker communists, which is what should have been done. And that era belongs to the Stalin era leadership as well. Not just Stalin himself, but again, like on Molotov and others, because of all the many challenges they had after World War II, perhaps rebuilding the party's working class base wasn't emphasized enough. And in that we have a problem. And it manifested itself because the number of workers organized in the party consistently went down. It never reached the point where there wasn't any workers at all in there. That was never the case. But it went down from over 50% in the 30s to about 35% by the time you get to the 1980s. So the rest of the party is dominated by state officials, functionaries, intellectuals, higher paid layers of the working class, all of which contributed towards the strengthening of revisionism. All right. Irish Partisan says the KPRF, Communist Party of Belarus, Communist Party of Ukraine suffer from this weakness that you talk about. And yeah, even though, of course, certainly the KPRF and the Communist Party of Ukraine, Communist Party of Belarus deserve credit for some of the things they've done. The Communist Party of Ukraine and the KPRF themselves, let's be clear, were both of whom could have been and should have been in power in Russia and Ukraine by the middle of the 1990s. The KPRF under Zyuganov won the 1996 presidential election in Russia. They won. There's even Medvedev reflected that the whole thing had been rigged by the domestic compradors in Russia and by US imperialism. And yet the KPRF, despite winning the election, what did they do when Yeltsin and his masters came out into the open and cheated them? Now, unless I'm prepared to be corrected upon this, but other than protesting about it, there's no evidence to my mind that they did anything other than complain. They didn't rally the working class against the system. They didn't do anything. The imperialists and the compradors openly rigged the presidential election and continued to wage war upon the Russian working class. And the KPRF complained a lot about it, but they didn't do anything. Same in Ukraine. Petro Simonenko led the Communist Party of Ukraine to be the biggest single party in Ukraine after 1991. They were the biggest single party all the way through the 1990s. They were repeatedly cheated out of power by Leonid Kuchma, again, former Communist Party of Ukraine official, by the way, a manager of a major industrial concern in Ukraine. He openly rigged elections against the Communist Party of Ukraine, who should have been in government, but were always cheated out of it. And they didn't do anything either. You see, if you read the criticisms of made by the KPRF, and this is where Zyuganov and the KPRF leadership get rightly criticized by other Marxist-Leninists in Russia, because when it came to Black October, which I've talked about for the Patreon edition of the program, Zyuganov got photographed there once outside the White House and then was never seen again. Now, bear in mind, this is just after the KPRF had been legalized in Russia. So why did the KPRF not throw its weight behind the defenders of the White House, for instance? Why was there no attempt made by them as the biggest, as the most important force, and the people who claimed that to inherit the legacy of the CPSU? Why was no serious attempt made to mobilize the working class outside of Moscow? Again, this is a question that's raised about what role Zyuganov was playing at the time. Was he looking to become an institutionalized opposition to Yeltsin, an opposition that Yeltsin would accept on the grounds and on the basis that the KPRF would oppose him through the Duma, through Parliament, but would never do anything such as try and rally the working class to pose a challenge outside of the system to Yeltsin? So that's a legitimate question to ask. And the same is true of the Petro Simonenko and the Communist Party of Ukraine. They were openly cheated out of power on multiple occasions and did nothing about it, despite having a huge level of support in the working class areas, particularly of eastern Ukraine. And yet they failed to put in any serious challenge to the domestic oligarchy. And what happens after years and years and years in Ukraine of Simonenko and the CPU not challenging the domestic oligarchy, even when that oligarchy is out in the open rigging elections and cheating the Communist Party out of power that they had legitimately won through the bourgeois democratic constitution of Ukraine at the time, they did nothing. And so what happens in the case of Ukraine? Support for the CPU starts to implode because people have been voting for it for 10 years after independence, and it does nothing to challenge the oligarchy when it matters. And so by the time you get to 2003, 2004, what happens? Well, opposition to Kushma is co-opted and captured by who? Why, it's our old friends in the NGO complex funded by the NED, CIA, MI6, etc. One of the reasons why the portrayal of the Orange Revolution of 03-04, a colour revolution, is such a farce is that what I remember, and I can remember this at the time, the way that this was portrayed on British television was that this was a revolt against the evil, corrupt regime, pro-Moscow regime of Leonid Kuchma and his corrupt, autocratic, hand-picked candidate for the presidency of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych, against the great freedom-loving Westerner, Viktor Yushchenko. Now, of course, if you know anything about Leonid Kuchma, you know that that's a load of absolute tripe, because Leonid Kuchma is a long-time ally of Western Ukrainian fascist movements. All the way through the 90s, he'd been promoting them. In fact, the current denizens of Kiev can trace their political lineage back to Kuchma and Kravchuk, both of whom had been Communist Party of Ukraine officials, but both of whom promoted Banderism in the late period Soviet Union and all the way through the 1990s. And so by the time you get to 2003, what's happened is a really sick joke, which is that on the one hand, Kuchma, this complete stooge of Western imperialism, was being portrayed as somebody who was an ally of the Kremlin, which of course he wasn't. He was a product of the domestic oligarchy. So, but the opposition to the domestic oligarchy and corrupt politicians, because the Communist Party of Ukraine had failed to do anything serious to oppose the domestic oligarchy other than complain a lot, the oppositional energy, such as that existed, was easily captured, at least in the middle class sections of the population, by the NGO organizations aligned with the CIA and MI6, running their typical campaign, which banged on a lot about corruption, whilst of course ushering in people who were even worse. And so what you have in Ukraine is a case of a failure based on the fact that even those who were opposed to the dissolution of the USSR, were opposed to Gorbachev, were politically reformists themselves, were very, very weak on an ideological level, and were completely unprepared to seriously combat the pro-capitalist tendencies when the USSR existed, or the domestic oligarchy that grew out of the old CPSU to inherit countries like Ukraine. They were completely unprepared to fight them in serious ways, to prepare the working class for the fight that would be needed. In many ways, people like Zyuganov are very similar to Putin, because if you examined what Putin's enduring commitment has been, it's to the preservation of the unity and integrity of the Russian state, and the avoidance of class war escalating up to civil war. That's been one of his enduring obsessions. And with Zyuganov, it's fairly similar. When destiny called for him, he backed off. That's just simply a fact. And that's why he gets criticized a lot by other Marxist-Leninists in Russia, because they allege that essentially he's been part of a loyal opposition since 1993, which has license to criticize within the system, but doesn't really seriously challenge the system. It's an interesting thing to be talked about. Right. Good evening to CJ over there in Virginia. And we've got various other people here. Yep. Okay, I need to troll back. Alan says, recommend another book besides Socialism Betrayed on the Restoration of Capitalism in the USSR. Yeah, there's a book by Ludo Martins called The Velvet Counter-Revolution, which is very, very good. But the one that introduced me to a lot of this is the complete perestroika and the complete collapse of revisionism by Harpal Bra as well. That one's excellent. So there's two there to go at. Irish Partisan says many in the KPRF era CPSU origins are inspired by the USSR of the 60s and 70s. Yes, and it's not a surprise that that's the case. I mean, USSR in the 60s and the 70s was still developing, economically speaking. Life for the working class was, in many areas of the country, improving. The massive problems brought into existence by Khrushchev and Kosygin and others in capitalist restoration hadn't fully manifested themselves yet. But as the Kieran and Kenny book outlines, alienation was creeping back in and problems were there, but they weren't obvious yet. So it's understandable that people would look back to it. However, just looking back with nostalgia isn't what communists should be doing. We should be always analyzing and diving beyond the surface. And unfortunately, many communists everywhere don't do that. Right. And hello to Cobra Commander. Great name. And Irish Partisan says Khrushchev was responsible for the Virgin Lands policy, which ended in utter failure, not to mention his failures on the foreign policy front. Yeah, domestic policy wasn't any good either. And he gets credit for the housing complexes that he built to house workers in the major cities. I would say that also is something which needs to be critiqued properly. If you examine the housing that was built, or the Stalin era leadership wanted to be built, was designed around the idea that you were building homes fit for the ruling class, that being the workers of the ruling class, and the housing of the workers has to reflect their status. But what Khrushchev did was build a load of flats that were reminiscent of maybe slightly better versions of British council flats, which of course were better than in British terms than some of the slums that people were moved out of. But again, it's not building homes fit for a new ruling class. What you're doing is you as the leading bureaucratic layer are building essentially quick and easy accommodation for the working class. You're not building homes fit for the ruling class. That gives away what the intentions of that bureaucratic layer around Khrushchev were, in that they saw themselves as the rulers and the working class as something at best to be paid off and placated. And that's a crucial difference between a Marxist-Leninist approach to how you build the dictatorship of the proletariat to essentially a social democratic bureaucratic approach, which is all about giving things to the working class, not having the working class play their proper role, which is as the managers of society in the dictatorship of the proletariat, but treating workers in the Soviet Union like a Western social democratic party would treat workers in this country, which is as a politically uninformed mass to be bought off. It's two very different things there. Philbin says, one can always doubt the historicity of such stories, but one tale of the young miner Khrushchev is that he was a scab, a strikebreaker, to personally advance up the union's bureaucracy. I haven't heard that one. A lot of these stories were told after he died. I can't comment because I don't know. Cobra Commander says, Nikita Khrushchev was openly a class traitor kulak. Mao's representatives even made fun of him for it. Yes, I had heard that one before. MPC, many zeros and one. The job interview that I am currently attending is one for the job I already have. And I haven't played Premier Manager or Championship Manager for a very long time. So, Irish Partisan says, Marxist-Leninists in Belarus made the same criticism of the Communist Party of Belarus, describing them as an institutional opposition for failing to oppose the pro-capitalist tendencies of Lukashenko. Yeah, that's true. Lukashenko, of course, deserves a good deal of credit for preserving a certain amount of the Soviet legacy, but there's pro-capitalist tendencies in there also. And I think that it's a legitimate criticism to be made that you don't have to, and indeed you must, oppose color revolution tendencies in places like Belarus. But at the same time, you shouldn't be putting a figure like Lukashenko beyond criticism, given that, or indeed Putin in Russia, given that there are pro-capitalist tendencies around them, which would be tremendously damaging if they were unleashed and allowed to get their own way. And the fact that they are still there, and the fact that they are always pushing for a restoration of the good old days of the 90s, which is what they want, of course, why wouldn't they? You have to make the criticism. And yes, that might anger the authorities, but it's what you have to do. I know that the KPRF goes a little bit further in terms of criticizing, but they remind me of like people who used to criticize the bad advisors around the Tsar, to be honest, back in the days prior to the 1917 revolution. They criticize the people around Putin, but of course Putin himself sits at the center of a system which has as part of it dangerous comprador pro-capitalist tendencies who are they're on the back foot at the moment, and they're in a minority, but they're still there. They're still invited to all the big events. So this is why I don't believe that the approach of the KPRF leadership is one that is going to be ultimately beneficial for building communist power back inside Russia again. I think it'll probably have to come about from tendencies outside of the KPRF, who I believe I've come to see are far too institutionalized and have been for 30 years. Right. Cobra Commander says the point is we need to be ready and prepared and already fighting class war before Azov starts driving tanks in front of your children's school. If you wait for the perfect time, you're going to lose, and that is exactly the right point to make. Well, Cobra Commander says the 90s were awful. They were if you were a worker. If you're a capitalist in Russia, they were great. because you got to rip off anybody you liked and get away with it. So, okay, so we've gone off on something of a tangent, but that is, of course, the nature of the beast. Now, I think what I'll do is I'll put the discussion of addiction, etc., into another program. But I did want to address the so-called the revival of domino theory by the imperialists when it comes to Ukraine. The idea, of course, being that if Putin, the evil one, is allowed to win in Ukraine, that he will not stop there, that he will roll into Poland tomorrow and Berlin the next day after that. This, of course, isn't true. And the people saying it don't believe that it's true either. And we can tell this because of how they're acting. Are they, let's focus on the British here. Are the British and their political representatives, are they acting with great urgency to open up new shipyards, to dramatically rebuild the British industrial base? Are they looking to dramatically overhaul the British armed forces, which have fallen to the point where they could barely field an actual fighting force of around 40,000 men? It's smaller than at any time since the early 19th century. Are they doing any of those things? No. Neither the Conservative Party nor the opposition Labour Party are talking about doing any of those things. Olaf Scholz, the buffoonish figure who's the Chancellor of Germany, talked about doing a great revival of German militarism. He's setting himself up as the new Bismarck, and turns out that that's all going to go absolutely nowhere. That the German Constitutional Court's going to force them into making significant public spending cutbacks. Same's true of Italy. No attempt at military revivalism there. No attempt of it in Spain. The only country that went near to doing it was Poland. So not in any of the Comprador-run nations either. So this raises an interesting question. Did they ever really believe that the great and almighty Tsar Vladimir I was going to roll his armies all the way to Paris as if this was 1815 all over again? And the answer is, of course, no. No one actually ever believed that. Not for a moment. Not even the wilder elements within the opinion pages of the Daily Telegraph. So why say it? Well, there's a number of reasons why. Of course, the project in Ukraine was meant to solve all of their problems without having to resort to having to make dangerous political decisions about reindustrializing, even on the basis of just simple rearmament, or apparently simple rearmament. It was meant to solve all of these problems because it was meant to trigger the overthrow of Putin, the end of his system in Russia, and the restoration of those nakedly comprador elements that I was referring to just a moment ago. So the Ukraine project was supposed to solve this problem for them. Of course, the sanctions regime from 2014 onwards didn't secure the destruction of Putin, and neither did this one. Because, of course, they'd allowed themselves, the Western imperialists that is, to be captured by their own wishful thinking. However, the reason why they're coming out and saying all of it now, and why their rhetoric does not match the reality of their decision making, part of it is that they never believed for a second that Putin was going to roll the Russian armed forces all the way to Paris. He wouldn't have the men to do so, for a start, by the way. But also because even if the current political leaders actually did want to do a dramatic revival of the industrial bases of Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, and revive their armed forces, it would take a colossal investment, and that is simply something which the current political and economic setups in Western Europe and in the United States are simply not capable of doing. There's a lot of talk going around in the States about, oh, well, we need, and in Europe, about, well, we need 2 more years up to 2025. That's why we need to freeze the conflict and preserve something of Ukraine. Because if we can get up to 2025, all this money that we're putting into the revival of ammunition production inside Europe, that's going to start paying off. And it's going to, we're going to have a revived defense industry. We're going to have a revived armed forces, and that's going to enable us to seriously take on the Russians. None of this is going to happen, by the way. And it's not going to happen, not just because Putin has no intention of marching on Central Europe, even though he never did and never will do, barring, of course, suicidal attacks. But the reason why it isn't going to happen is because all of this money that they're dumping into, particularly the defense industry of the United States, where is it going to actually go? Now, it may be that you will get some upscaling of production, but I'll tell you where an awful lot of it will go. It'll go in roughly the same places as the quantitative easing and bank bailouts go to the banks, but in this case it'll be the arms companies. It'll go towards stock buybacks. It'll get filtered out through a million fraudulent processes. It'll go to boost short-term profits. It won't go in serious long-term investment in plant and machinery. That is what it will not do. It will be frittered away by the corporate executives. It'll be stolen and disappeared in 1,000 different ways. And the same will be true in Britain. The same will be true in Western Europe. However much money they dump into this system, which is not capable on its current basis of existence, it's not capable of actually producing the great revival in industrial production which they think they are going to get. The same was true, by the way, of the attempted industrial revivals in the United States under Donald Trump, where he dumped an awful lot of money into trying to lure industrial capitalism into making investments, and he barely got any uptick at all out of it. Why? It's because of the stage of capitalism that we're in. Later stage imperialism is purely parasitic in that you have, again, a very low rate of profit. You have a system which exists to extract capital and export it elsewhere. It doesn't exist. It doesn't want to, because the rate of return is too small, invest in seriously in industrial production, in expanding the industrial base. It doesn't want to do that and won't do that if you do what Biden is doing or what the Europeans are doing, is you just dump the money in and leave the private companies to their own devices. The only way you could actually get this dramatic improvement in arms production that they say they want but are not prepared to do anything about is if you actually did what the British were forced to do in 1940, which is that the same problem existed, because it was the same, essentially, although not quite as rotten as it is now, but British capitalism in 1939 to 40 was not that much better than it is now. Yes, you had a bigger industrial base, but it was an industrial base that was dwindling due to lack of investment. And so when the British government started putting in these big defense orders in order to try and revive the production, particularly of aircraft, you got a lot of money being dumped in, a lot of orders being made, and they consistently failed. The private companies consistently failed to deliver upon the orders. Now, why was that? Well, because they were pocketing the money and weren't investing. They weren't organizing production in the most efficient way possible. They were carrying on in the same old inefficient fashion, pocketing the money and getting a payout. And so the British government was obliged to actually take over the entirety of the management of the war industries. Because if they'd left it to the capitalist class to actually do the defense production that was required, the armaments production that was required, there would have been no triumph in the Battle of Britain or anything else, because they just simply wouldn't have produced the aircraft or the ammunition necessary to win it. The war production would have collapsed because the capitalists were incredibly inefficient managers of that system. They had to, in the end, put state officials in charge of everything and essentially get the factories run by the state in order to meet the necessary production quotas. And until they do the same thing here, until you see them doing the same thing with regard to domestic defense production, you can disregard any talk of them having a war with Russia, because the capitalist class themselves are so decayed, so corroded, so completely incapable of even investing properly to carry out the necessary radical changes in production and expansion of production that will be necessary for even the United States to stand a chance at fighting a war against Russia for more than about 2 weeks. Then none of it is going to happen because the system's too far gone. Until until a US Bonapartist raises their head, and does essentially the kind of radical shake-up of industrial production that would be required to get anywhere near what the Russians are producing in terms of defense output now, then you can disregard all of the talk that comes from these people. They can't have a war against the Russians because they couldn't sustain one, and they're not radicalizing their production methods. So you can disregard all of this shit. All it is an attempt to make sure that the Europeans remain committed to funding this debacle that is rumbling on inside Ukraine right now. And the US is attempting to spin this in such a way as to keep the war going, by keeping the Ukrainians in the field for as long as possible, and also to preserve something of a supposedly independent Ukraine, so that in the interests of the short-term and narrow political interests of the current ruling group in the White House, can say going into the election in the upcoming year that we have preserved a strong, independent and sovereign Ukraine, even though, of course, it's never anything of the sort and hasn't been for 30 years. But that's beside the point. Reality here for them doesn't matter. The only thing is that they can point to a map in June of next year and say, Ukraine is still sovereign and independent. Putin's plan of Europe-wide conquest has been thwarted. You have to say that Tsar Putin has an idea that he's going to conquer all of Europe, which of course he doesn't, in order to say then that you've thwarted it. So even if Ukraine is obliged to surrender everywhere from Kharkov all the way down to Odessa, then you can still say, well, if it wasn't for the amazing plans that we had and all the assistance we've given to Ukraine, he would have taken all of it. And even if that goes wrong, and even if what we end up with is a Russia that has a western border that resembles the old Tsardom in 1914, which is, of course, would consist of everything along the Black Sea coast and everything up to and including Kiev, or Malo Russia, I think it used to be called, and then the far western bits that used to belong to Hungary and Poland, or the bits that are left over. Even if they've just managed to preserve that, they'll say, see, if we hadn't have provided assistance, he would have gone all the way to Berlin. And even if that falls apart, they can then, but they would prefer for it not to. They'll still be saying, well, if we hadn't done all that, Putin would be on the Atlantic coast by now. He'd be sipping non-alcoholic beer under the Eiffel Tower. You see, it's all just bullshit. It's all just stories that they need to tell to each other, principally, but also the incredibly dim-witted and cowardly and short-sighted petty bourgeoisies of Europe, who believe every lie that they're told because they have still have a direct class interest in believing all those lies and supporting the decaying system. So, let's go back to comments here. Irish Partisan says, I see the comprador windbag Svetlana Tikhanovskaya ranting and raving about the Domino fear on Twitter most days. Well, I think what she's after is maintaining her own funding stream. Now that old Luka has changed the laws to make sure that they have to return to Belarus to get their passports renewed, I think these lot are feeling like they've missed the boat. Talk about people who bet on the wrong horse at the wrong time. Elise says, I think we, the West, lost the domino game. I think they lost it 50 years ago, to be honest. Unused Sub says, Spanish army could fit inside the Santiago Bernabeu twice. Yeah, same with the British army. The actual size of the British army, I believe, is 80,000, so we could fit it in Old Trafford in Manchester. Irish Partisan says, the armchair warlord wrote a great message on X talking about this, how Western political establishment rant on about how Putin is a threat to us all, yet are not rearming or mobilizing the populations. Yeah, I mean, the point isn't just that they don't believe it. I think some of them do believe it. But the other point is that I think they're also incapable of doing doing industrial reorganizations. Never mind appealing to the population. They're not capable of doing that at all. They're far more terrified of their own domestic populations than they ever are of Putin. Because Putin's not interested in occupying Britain, not in a million years. I don't think any Russians are. Why would they want it? But they are afraid of destabilizing the domestic political arrangements that they have, which would be destabilized by an attempt to do any kind of mobilization for war. If they tried to do that, then Britain would be destabilized, and that's the thing that they cannot risk. Movie Maker Joe, good evening. Martin asks, is that Ludo Martin's book available anywhere in English or in French for that matter? Googling, but can't find anything. It is available in French. I read it because I essentially got hold of a French version and ran it through. I read it using my incredibly bad high school French and then ran the bits I didn't understand through an automatic translator. I'll try to find it and post it in the Telegram group if I can. Philbin says, exactly, imperial debacles only really succeed in greasing the palms of arms dealers and war profiteers, no relation to battlefield success. Banderites got more than Russian military budget, now plead poverty. Yeah, because a lot of it's gone out the other side into somebody else's pocket. Also, if you throw more money and resources into a rotten system that just leaks money and just goes straight through the system and into somebody's bank account, then all you're going to do is make the corrupt parties in the system even richer than they are already. Won't be less corrupt under government management. Depends. NPC Many 01. It would depend upon the nature of government management. If it was just government management to guarantee the private owners more money, then yes, you'd be completely correct. That's why I say I'm not taking it seriously until you see an American Bonapartist type figure emerge who's prepared to tell the shareholders of the arms companies and other companies that they're going to have to take a hit for the greater good of their own class. And I can't see that emerging in the immediate future. It may emerge if class struggle in the United States reaches a point where the American ruling class, to preserve themselves, are prepared to contemplate the emergence of a Bonaparte type figure. But I think that would be principally somebody who would be directed at the working class rather than the ruling class. The system, I think, is just too far gone and too rotten to save fundamentally. Lisa says, it's crazy because economically Russia and China are years ahead of us, but we still argue MAGA or snowflake, this or that. Well, all bourgeois politics is meant to do is to distract you. It's not meant to illuminate anything. Movie Maker Joe, anyone can thumbs up, then take away the thumb up and see what happens. The state really is backwardly stupid. Well, that's the degenerate system we live under. Frank says, same thing happened to the aluminium production during World War II in the US. Government got into production after war, auctioned it off cheap. Yeah. When they need to, they used to be able to find ways of producing producing resources in a very efficient fashion and then sell off the thing that the state had built to private capital. Right, okay. We've not gone on to the agenda that I had, but I think it's been an interesting discussion. Anyway, I'm going to leave it there now. We've hit the hour mark, and I will be back with you again tomorrow. So I'm going to do the Capitalism and Addiction program tomorrow at the same time, and the audio version of this will be up later tonight on Patreon. Until tomorrow, thank you everybody who has tuned in. Be sure to like and share the stream if you haven't already. And I'll be back with you again at the same time tomorrow.
Oh, Stalin was a mighty man, and a mighty man was he. He led the Soviet people on the road to victory. All through the revolution, he fought at Lenin's side, and they made a combination till the day that Lenin died. He said, come on, you people, we must work with brain and hand. And then one day the Nazis came into the Soviet land. They plundered to the Volga, to Stalingrad. And then Joe Stalin said, come on, me boys, and kick them out again. Oh, Stalin was a southerner, in Georgia he was born, where the oranges grow thick and fast and fields of waving corn. And Stalin is a farmer, his fingers they are green, and he has planted the biggest crop the world has ever seen. One day he looked upon the map and frowned and shook his head. There's too much brown and not enough green, these were the words he said. We'll have to change the weather, boys, he said, and then he smiled. So let's begin by planting trees along 3,000 miles.